When a black businessman was arrested for breaking into his own home, it became the spark that ignited a storm of protests and revelations. A single act of injustice laid bare the depths of racial bias and changed the lives of thousands. What happened next will stun even the most seasoned observers. But let's start at the beginning. Dwayne Harper parked his sleek black Range Rover in front of a spacious vintage house he had recently purchased. Walking confidently in a light blazer and slacks, he stepped out of the vehicle, surveying the weathered facade with a critical eye. The house, though in need of repairs, had immense potential. For Dwayne, a successful real estate entrepreneur, it was another dream project in the making. Across the street, Mrs. Carmichael, an elderly white woman with a sharp gaze, peered through her curtains. The sight of a stranger, especially a black man, immediately aroused her suspicion. Her heart raced as her mind jumped to conclusions, and without hesitation, she grabbed her phone. "Hello, police," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a suspicious man at the Whitmore's property. He's definitely up to no good." Within minutes, 2 police cars screeched to a halt in front of the house. Officers Daniels and Morgan stepped out, scanning the area. They spotted Dwayne, who had just walked around the house and was about to unlock the door. "Hey, step away from the house!" Daniels barked, drawing his baton. Dwayne froze, bewildered. "I own this house. I have the documents to prove it," he said calmly, reaching into his pocket for his phone. "Hands up where I can see them," Morgan interrupted, his hand resting nervously on his holster. A small crowd of neighbors began to gather. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others pulled out their phones to record the scene. "I own this house," Dwayne repeated loudly, his voice drowned out by the officer's commands. Morgan rushed forward and, despite Dwayne's protests, slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. "Leave him alone!" a young woman shouted, capturing everything on camera. The officers ignored the growing tension. "You're under arrest for trespassing," Daniels stated coldly. Humiliated and furious, Dwayne silently climbed into the back of the police car. As the vehicle pulled away, his eyes swept over the crowd, catching their anxious, disbelieving stares. One thought echoed in his mind: "This is my house, and I will prove it." As the police drove off, the video of his arrest began spreading across social media, setting the stage for a wave of public outrage. Dwayne Harper sat in a chilly interrogation room, his hands still cuffed. Officers Daniels and Morgan stood nearby, speaking as though they were dealing with a criminal rather than a homeowner. Dwayne remained silent, though anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. "You have no right to treat me like this," he finally said, breaking the tense silence. His voice was steady, despite the humiliation he felt. "Let me contact my attorney. We'll decide what you can and can't do," Daniels replied curtly, casting him a dismissive glance. Half an hour later, the door swung open and a determined woman in a sharp suit strode in. Dwayne's attorney, Amanda Silverstein. Her icy glare cut through the tension. "Release my client immediately," Daniels scoffed. "He's under arrest for trespassing, ma'am, so if you—" "Here are the ownership documents," Amanda interrupted, slamming a folder of papers onto the table. "This house belongs to Mr. Harper. Every move you made today was captured on video, and this arrest is a blatant act of racial profiling." Morgan flipped through the documents quickly, his face going pale. "Is this accurate?" he muttered under his breath. "Now, remove the handcuffs," Amanda demanded coldly. Gritting his teeth, Daniels barked an order to have the cuffs removed. Dwayne rubbed his wrists but remained silent, his expression calm yet resolute. "You've made a huge mistake," he said quietly, locking eyes with Daniels, "and I won't let this go." Meanwhile, the video of his arrest, recorded by bystanders, had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of systemic racism. Black man arrested at his own home. What more proof do we need? Calls flooded the police station from outraged citizens and civil rights groups. Within hours, the officer's superiors summoned them for an emergency meeting. At home, Dwayne finally felt a fleeting sense of freedom, but no satisfaction. On the porch, his wife Evelyn and their teenage son Jason waited anxiously. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with barely contained tears. "I'm fine," he replied, embracing her. "But this is bigger than me now. This has to stop." As his phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls from the media, Dwayne realized this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would have to stand as a voice for justice. The next morning, Dwayne Harper stood by the window of his living room, watching as a crowd of reporters gathered outside his home. Cameras, microphones, and rapid-fire questions. It was a full-blown media frenzy. The video of his arrest had gone viral, igniting public outrage and sparking heated debates about systemic racism in policing. Dwayne picked up his phone and called Amanda. "I'm ready to make a statement," he said firmly. An hour later, he stepped onto his porch. The cameras froze, and the journalist leaned forward eagerly. Dwayne raised his hand, calling for silence. "Yesterday, I was arrested for the crime of being a black man on my own property," he began, looking directly into the cameras. "This was not just an isolated incident. It is a symptom of the systemic bias that millions face every day, and I refuse to stay silent." His words reverberated through the news and social media, sparking protests outside the police station. Activists demanded justice and reforms to law enforcement practices. Meanwhile, the chief of police called an emergency meeting. Officers Daniels and Morgan were suspended pending an investigation. "We can't ignore the public backlash," the chief admitted. Daniels scowled. "We were just doing our job," he protested. But the video told a different story, one of officers disregarding Dwayne's statements and acting on implicit bias. Dwayne wasn't content with just speaking out. He organized a meeting with civil rights groups and community leaders. The event, held at the local cultural center, drew dozens of attendees. "We all know this isn't an isolated incident," Dwayne said, standing at the microphone. "But this is an opportunity to demand transparency, reforms, and justice." His words were met with thunderous applause. Among the attendees was Mrs. Carmichael, who now wore an expression of deep regret. After the event, Mrs. Carmichael approached Dwayne. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice trembling. "I was the one who called the police. I thought I was protecting our neighborhood, but now I see how wrong I was. I'm so sorry." Dwayne studied her for a moment. "Acknowledging your mistake is the first step toward change," he replied. National media continued to cover the story, with politicians and celebrities voicing their support for Dwayne. His ordeal had become a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination. That evening, sitting at home with his wife Evelyn and son Jason, Dwayne said, "This isn't the end, but we're moving in the right direction." 2 weeks after the incident, Dwayne Harper once again found himself in the spotlight. Standing outside the courthouse, surrounded by lawyers, activists, and reporters, he had filed a lawsuit against the police department for wrongful arrest. The public eagerly awaited justice. "We're not just seeking compensation," his attorney Amanda declared to the crowd. "We're demanding real reforms. This case must set a precedent." The trial began swiftly. Prosecutors presented the viral video, showing officers ignoring Dwayne's repeated statements and handcuffing him without cause. "On what grounds was this arrest made?" Amanda asked Officer Daniels during cross-examination. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "He looked suspicious," he mumbled. "Suspicious? Do you mean because he was black?" Amanda pressed sharply. The courtroom fell silent. Witnesses, including neighbors, testified. Mrs. Carmichael, trembling as she took the stand, admitted, "I called the police because I was scared. But now I see that fear was rooted in prejudice. I'm deeply ashamed." Her admission sent shockwaves through the room. This trial was no longer just about Dwayne. It had become a public reckoning with racial bias. Eventually, the police department agreed to a settlement. While Dwayne received significant compensation, he chose to allocate most of the funds to establishing the Voice of Justice Foundation, aimed at supporting victims of racial discrimination. Simultaneously, the police department announced mandatory bias training for officers and the creation of a community oversight board to ensure accountability. At a press conference, Dwayne delivered a powerful closing statement. I'm grateful for the support, but this isn't the end, he said. Systemic racism won't be dismantled by one case, but if we keep fighting, if we keep demanding change, we can make a difference. The crowd erupted in applause. Among them was Mrs. Carmichael, who later approached Dwayne. Mr. Harper, I'd like to help with your foundation, she said. Dwayne smiled. I'll accept your help. Change starts with acknowledging mistakes and working to correct them. Meanwhile, the house at the center of it all was nearing the end of its renovation. Dwayne decided not to keep it as private property, but to turn it into a cultural center for the local community. At the grand opening, he stepped up to the microphone. This center is a testament to how something good can emerge from injustice, he said. The crowd erupted into applause once more. Standing beside his family, Dwayne felt a renewed sense of purpose. His fight was far from over, but now he had the strength and support to continue the journey toward justice and equality.